Thank you for taking a good chunk of your Saturday to talk about church budgets. That means we have an unusual crowd of people here today, and I'm thankful for you. Let me introduce myself. I'll do a few more introductions of you all. I'll explain what we're doing, and then we'll get into it. So as John said, my name is Dunlop. The year that John lived in our basement was during the COVID lockdown, so we got to know each other really, really well. And what a joy to have a dear Christian brother to be with us during those months. I, as he mentioned, serve as one of the associate pastors at Capitol Hill Church in Washington, D.C. I've been in that capacity for the last 15 years. Before then, I was a member there, working in business there in D.C., up in San Francisco for a few years back in D.C. And because I have a background in business, I tell people I'm the associate pastor who dislikes administration the least. And that means that I get thrown all the questions about budgets and buildings and legal stuff. So that's a relatively small piece of my job, but I do give special attention to thinking through our budgets as a church. And so it's my privilege to just share with you some of what I've gleaned in the last 15 years of thinking through our church budget. I want to do some more introductions. John already had a number of us introduce our names, and some people have come in since then. I'm not going to go around and get everybody's name, but I do want to know what roles we all play with regard to the budget. So if you at your church are the main preaching pastor of your church, go ahead and stand up. Okay. Which I think is a very important role as we think about the budget, as we think about budget. So thank you, brothers, for all you guys do. If you are a deacon in your church, please go ahead and stand up. Okay. And I'll actually take names this time. So if you could share your name and your church, Joe, and kind of what being a deacon looks like for you. Shout it out.
Sure. So Joe Overson Church in Santa Monica, deacon of finance. I support the lead pastor with the budget and financing, reporting to the elder board.
Oh, is this not working? Yeah, it's kind of. Okay. Go ahead. Great.
We are church plant 2 years, and so we kind of do everything, including that.
Okay, they do everything. Good.
Currently the treasurer.
Okay, treasurer. Good. Excellent. And what is being a deacon involved at Greater Heights? Okay, excellent. Good. Okay, great. That's helpful. Thank you. If you serve as an elder at your church, please go ahead and stand up. Okay. And then presume we have all the senior. You're a deacon and an elder. Okay. Thank you, brother. So you can sit down. If you are we have one treasurer over here. Any other treasurers? Okay, great. And remind me of your church, White Avenue Community Church in Pomona. White Avenue and Living Rock. Okay. Are any of you CPAs? No. Okay. Well, then you don't have to answer CPA questions. Go ahead and be seated. Good. Are there any other roles I missed? Oh, Finance Committee. Who serves on the Finance Committee? Okay. We have a few Finance Committee members. Good. Thank you. That's great. Okay, now are there any roles I missed? Leadership Committee. Okay. So we have the Leadership Committee right here? There's a few others, but you guys are the Leadership Committee who care enough about the budget to show up on a Saturday. Good. That's a special, unique role. Excellent. Well, thank you for all that you do as you think about stewarding resources. As we get into this, I'm going to try to make the case that a church budget is much more than just the numbers on the page. It is, I think, in many ways, the best articulation of the spiritual values of your church. And so if you are the main preaching pastor of your church, you're trying to set that vision from God's word, but everybody else in this room is very much trying to put that vision into place in a way I think is probably more powerful than most churches realize as you think about what to do with your budget. So let me give you an overview of our time together. We're going to get started with the first of two talks. And so if you look on the next page, you see the handout for that, Budgeting for a Healthy Church. That's session number 1. And then we're going to have some extended time for Q&A. We're going to have lunch. We'll come back after lunch. I'm going to do a second talk, particularly about how we can encourage healthy giving in our churches. So you can think about session 1 is a lot about spending. Session 2 is a lot about receiving that money. We'll do some more Q&A. And then the last page of your handout, I have some discussion questions. I'm hoping to divide you up by churches and walk you through a number of different questions. And if you're the only person here from your church, I'm going to put you in a group with other people who are the only person here from their churches. But my hope is that this is not just me feeding content to you, but also you all trying to apply some of these things and consider what you might do differently in your own churches. The first page of your handout is some of the data you all sent me when you registered, so thank you for doing that. You can see across the top, if you're wondering, okay, who are the churches represented here? Well, about a third of us have less than $250,000 budgets. A third of us are kind of medium-sized churches, between $250,000 and $1 million, and a third of us would be over $1 million. About 60% of us, roughly, have seen those budgets grow over the last 5 years. About 40% of us have seen those budgets shrink over the last 5 years. I don't know why I asked this question, but it's interesting. To the right, 2/3 of us, roughly, have a calendar year budget cycle. So that probably means that you are beginning to think about budgeting right now as you head into the fall. And a third of us are all over the map in terms of when we do it. Our church is August 1st, so we just started our new budget. In other churches, I saw July 1st. I saw some in the middle of April. That middle graph also is about what we do with our budgets. And this is what I've grown to expect, but it was interesting to see it on the page, which is basically, if you're a small church, I have no idea what you do with your budget. Many of you as small churches are spending most of your money, if not all your money, on the salary of your senior pastor, but that's far from universal. Many small churches have budgets that kind of go all different directions, but if you are a larger church, most likely you're spending about 50% of your budget on staff. And I've seen that to be remarkably consistent across churches over the years, and that's what you guys have here in the LA area. What do you do with the rest of the money? So the bottom chart is just those 5 churches that are larger. And again, there's very few patterns. Some of us spend a lot of money on facilities. My guess is those are the churches that still have outstanding debt on a facility or they're trying to pay rent. Some of us spend a lot more money on missions and outreach. Nobody here spends that much of their budget on programs. So I saw, at least for the larger churches, that ranged from 2% to I think about 12%. But where we tended to spend money outside of staff was either missions or facilities, probably depending on their circumstances. So I'm a data geek. I love things like this. You may not be, but if you are, Merry Christmas, a little early. Hope you enjoy looking at the data to see who's here. So let's turn over to the session number 1, and I'll just walk you through this handout. I mainly want to ask the question, why does a budget matter? And then I want to take the answer to that question and apply it across the different sections of our budget. Many pastors, I think, honestly find the topic of church budgets to be a bit of a snoozer. You know, they didn't teach me that stuff in seminary. I'm not much of a numbers guy anyway. Can't our treasurer take care of that? I assume that you are either not in that category because you're here, or, you know, your treasurer forced you to come. And that's why you're here if you're a senior pastor. So thank you, whichever category you're in. But nonetheless, let me start by talking about why a budget matters. And I think that's honestly a trickier question to get our hands around than it might first appear. It matters because, as Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. He certainly told us that thinking about individuals. I think it very much applies to churches as well. Where your church's treasure is, there its heart will be also, which is something I think really moves in two directions, for individuals and for churches. It's both the thermometer and the thermostat, right? That means that my heart will follow my treasure, right? If I've invested a lot in Tesla stock, then I'm going to be very interested when I hear news about Elon Musk on the news. But also, it means that my treasure will influence my heart. And so if I find my heart is not in a good place, what I do with my treasure is going to change what I care about. So if I want to know what your church really values, I'm going to look past your website. I'm going to look past the glossy brochure that you give people when they visit your church for the first time. I'm going to look past your membership class. I'm going to look at your budget, right? That's what your church really values. The budget is the most honest, the most influential articulation of the spiritual values that your congregation really has, which means that every budget tells a story. For some churches, that story is a happy one, with the numbers getting bigger and bigger every year. For some churches, that story is a difficult one, living as a church with our hopes stuck in the past, funding what we used to fund in our glory days, hoping that maybe those glory days will come back. For other churches, that story, their budget tells, is an angry one, a story of appeasing factions or backroom deals and egos and conflict. But the story a church budget should tell is the story that Jesus told in Matthew 13, when he said that the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hid in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. It's got to be one of Jesus' simplest parables. I think it's one of my favorites because of how it articulates the joy of following him. When a church sees the value of Jesus Christ, when his kindness and mercy and justice, beauty, goodness, power have captured our hearts as a church, then a church budget tells a story of us joyfully parting with what this world values in order to tell the world about who he is. That's the story a church budget should tell. So a budget matters because of the story it tells, because of the values it reveals. That's why it matters to us. But I think an even more important question is why it matters to God. Right? Which is the question I really want to use to frame all of our discussions for the rest of the day. And as I mentioned before, it's actually a fairly challenging question to answer precisely because God doesn't need your budget. Right? Why does your budget matter to God if he doesn't need your budget? We don't always talk that way as if God doesn't need your budget. Sometimes, I get up in front of the congregation and I plead with them to give money so we can fund a missionary or some member each city, imploring them to give up the Starbucks beverage or pizza or whatever it is, once a week so that instead of buying half-calf lattes, we can fund someone to go tell those people about Jesus. Which kind of implies that God needs their money, but the fact is God doesn't need their money. Think about Psalm 50, verse 12. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, God says, for the world is mine and all that is in it. Right? God's plans are in no way conditioned on your generosity. Isaiah 46:10, God says, my purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please. This is the God, Ephesians 1:11, who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will, regardless of what your church chooses to do with its budget. Right? God doesn't need your money. So why does he care about it? Well, to answer that question, I want to turn to another parable in the book of Matthew, Matthew 25, which, if you've thought about stewardship and budgets before, is a very typical place for us to go. The parable of the talents. So let me start reading in verse 14. And Jesus has been telling parables about the kingdom of heaven. So he says, for it, the kingdom of heaven, will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here, I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also who had the 2 talents came forward saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more. His master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also who had received the 1 talent came forward saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid and went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, have what is yours. But his master answered him, you wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I scattered no seed? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and in my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Well, as I find is so true of many of Jesus' parables, this one has a twist at the end. And without that twist, which is also true of many of Jesus' parables, the parable almost seems moralistic. Right? Do your best. If you work hard for God, he'll be pleased with you, which is not the gospel of grace. And yet that reading is precisely upside down. After all, the first servant received the exact same commendation as the second servant, even though he accomplished twice as much. And the twist is what happens to the third servant. At the end of the parable, the master sends him to hell. Did you notice that? In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And if you're reading this with fresh eyes, you think, really? That seems kind of hard, right? He didn't steal the money. He gave it back. Hell? Just because he didn't double what he was given? That doesn't sound fair at all. What's going on here? Well, what's going on here is the gospel. Right? The key that unlocks this parable is what the third servant's actions communicate about his real master. But think about what the third servant's doing. He is trying to serve not one master, but 2. He was pursuing a healthy risk mitigation strategy where he would be in a good place if the master came back, and he'd be in a good place if the master didn't come back. He'd be fine if the master returned because he'd still have the money. He didn't steal it from him. But if it turned out the master wasn't good to his promise to return, he would have not wasted his time on the master's business. I don't know if it's because he doubted whether the master was good to his promise to return or good to his promise to reward the servants when he did return. But the fact is, the servant did his own thing while the master was away. But any doubt about this master is ridiculous. Right? The master represents God. So when the third servant says, I knew you to be a hard man, he shows that he doesn't actually know this man at all. His choices show that his faith was only in himself, and his actions and words only defame the excellence of the master, which is very different than the first two servants. They believed that risking everything for the master was the very best thing they could do for themselves. And they were right. Don't miss how the reward is described. What does Jesus say? He says, enter into the joy of your master. Where having gambled everything on the goodness of their master, their reward is to enjoy forever the goodness of their master. So the twist at the end of the parable shows that this is a parable about faith. As Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, no one can serve two masters. You may think you can serve two masters, right? Living for yourself and doing just enough for God to slip into heaven if it turns out that heaven is real. The third servant is double-minded. And so his life, his choices did not evidence a weak faith. They evidenced that he had no faith. James tells us that even the demons believe in God and they shudder. What's the difference between that demonic faith and saving faith? Well, saving faith doesn't simply believe facts about God. It believes that God is good for us. It believes that his rewards are worth having. Faith that pleases God, Hebrews 11:6, is faith that believes that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. That idea of reward is critical to faith because reward says, whatever he's got, I want it because I trust him with my life. Saving faith believes that God is so good that we can joyfully venture everything on his promises. And when we do that, our lives become living advertisements of how good and desirable God is. But when someone says, I want to get into heaven, but I also want to hedge my bets because I don't really trust God's plans for me, then that life becomes a living advertisement that God is not good, that God is not trustworthy. They are like that faithless servant. The fact that faith takes center stage in this parable does not demean the faithful servant's productivity or suggest that in some way it didn't please their master. Instead, it shows us that productivity wasn't ultimately what God cares about. The master rejoiced in their work not for its own sake, because he doesn't need the money, but because it revealed the servant's faith that he was worthy. So remember how the master described the faith of those first two servants. He says they were faithful. In faith-filled obedience, they bet with their lives that their master was worth everything. And so their lives testified to his goodness and glory, which is why we talk about faithfulness as God's goals for all of our stewardships. Our stewardship for our time and our relationships and our talents, which comes from this parable. And of course, for our church budgets. So let me unpack this idea of faithfulness from this parable, and then I want to apply that concept to various pieces of a church budget. Faithfulness is used in many different ways in the scriptures. Here in Matthew 25, the concept of faithfulness can really be summarized in two concepts: obedience and risk. So faithfulness is obedient risk-taking. The obedience part of that equation, I think, is evident enough. As Christians, the ends never justify the means because God has so often given the means by virtue of his commands. We don't go about his work, especially in regard to the church, as if the only thing that matters is the end result. Our job is to listen to his word and to obey. But faithfulness isn't just about obedience. It's certainly not about boring obedience, because faith always involves risk of a type. Risking what this world holds on to because we know that God's promises are certain. When the path to follow Jesus and the path of this world run in parallel, obedience doesn't testify very much to the worth and value of Jesus Christ. But when obedience means risking what this world loves, it becomes a bold statement about the goodness and trustworthiness of the master. That is so different from how many churches use the word stewardship and faithfulness to basically talk about being miserly. That's not it at all. Risk-taking obedience reveals the goodness and glory of God, which is what matters most in God's economy. That means your actions are valuable in all of life for much more than what they just accomplish. They're valuable because of what they proclaim about God. His glory is paramount. Right? So let's say that you're trying to decide, do I go on a nice vacation or do I give my money to my church? And you consider God's promise that treasure in heaven can never be destroyed, Matthew 6:20, and you give the money to your church. Why does that please God? Well, not because he needs your money, though he will potentially do great things with it. Instead, he delights in your generosity because it shows that you believe his word. Or maybe you take the vacation instead, reveling in the overwhelming goodness of God as you enjoy his good gifts with thanksgiving, like 1 Timothy 4 says. Either way, your faith behind your action is what matters because of the statement it makes about God. Right? Your pocketbook matters to God because of whatever it proclaims about him, not because of the stuff it produces. Your church budget matters to God because of what it proclaims about him, not because of all the good ministry it produces. That's wonderful, but he didn't need you to do that. He cares about our faith because that's what proclaims the excellence of who he is. So I want to take that concept of faithfulness, risk-taking obedience. I want to use that to define what a church budget is, and then we'll just walk through a church budget, think about how it changes our attitude toward different aspects of a church budget. And you can see there on your handout my definition for a church budget: a plan to obediently invest our congregation's money through faith in God's promises. You can have a different definition of church budget. I'm not going to argue about definitions, but this is one I found to be helpful. And I underlined a few words there. It's a plan. It's not a promise. Uncertainty is okay. Keep in mind that faithfulness is inherently risky. If we don't risk anything, is it really faith? And so a budget is a plan, not a promise. And a budget involves obedience. Sometimes we operate even as Christians as if we can go about God's work any way we want so long as we achieve good results for him. But that's certainly not what Jesus teaches. We're not chess masters. We are the chess pieces. Accomplishing great things for God by following your own rules isn't faithful. And it doesn't say good things about God, does it? It says good things about you. On the contrary, when we decide to go our own way instead of his, it says that God's ways are not worth following. It profanes the one we supposedly serve. So a faithful church budget seizes on obedience at every opportunity because it wants to align its principles with the principles of God's word, because we're about showing off his wisdom, not our own. So it's obedience. I use that word invest. I want to be careful there. I'm not a prosperity teacher. The Bible, more importantly, is not a prosperity teacher. We don't give money to our church so that I can go out and get a Porsche next week. That's not how it works. God gives us something much better than a Porsche. He gives us treasure in heaven. So let's not be small-minded prosperity gospel teachers. Let's be big-minded gospel teachers. And yet, I do find it helpful to compare a church budget to an investment vehicle, like a mutual fund. But think about how a mutual fund works. Thousands of investors entrust their savings to a fund manager who looks for the very best investments in line with that fund's goals. And then someday, like the day before your daughter's getting married or the day before you retire, you pull the money out and you expect to have seen a return on that money. Well, very similar to your church budget. Right? Every year, my congregation invests a very significant amount of their wealth in our church budget. And as elders, we scramble around looking for the very best places to invest it in line with our fund's goals, which are the promises of Jesus Christ. Someday, each of those dear saints will stand before the Lord in heaven to give account for what they've done with what he's entrusted to them. Their money is going to be a piece of that. And my desperate hope and prayer is that when they give that final accounting to Christ, they are eternally grateful for every dollar they invested in their church budget. Not because it got them a Porsche, but because it went out to be used for Great Commission purposes, investing in God's promises, and they see a bountiful harvest of what it produces. So that's why I use that word invest. We invest our congregation's money through faith in God's promises. Right? This is about prudent risk-taking. Much of what is in your budget should not make any sense unless God is good to fulfill his promises. So I was interviewing real estate agents a few years ago to sell a property that we had at the church. And I remember talking to this one guy, and he was just not a Christian. And he was trying to butter me up by telling me, what wonderful things we did with our church's money. I don't think he had any idea what we did with our church's money, and I just thought, well, you just lost my credibility right there. Because I know if you knew what we did with our church's money, you would not say those things. Because we are investing our money in things that you as a non-Christian don't value, and that's the whole point. I did not hire him. So what you do with your budget should not make any sense unless God is good to fulfill his promises. We are investing in his promises, not the acclaim of the world. And yet we must recognize, this is where it gets a little fuzzy, that there is often not a guaranteed link between God fulfilling his promises and what we do with our budgets, which comes back to the element of risk. Right? If we decide to send a missionary to northern India, well, we are making a statement of faithfulness in God's promises, but we don't know what's going to happen. Maybe they get sick and they have to come home after 3 weeks. Well, that was a risk. But it's a risk in the good promises of God. We don't know what's going to happen. I was struck when I was reading through 1 Samuel 14 recently. There's an account of Jonathan, his armor bearer, deciding to, just the two of them, attack the whole Philistine garrison. And this is what Jonathan says. He says, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of those uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few." And I thought, that is so true to life. God did not promise, if you go to that garrison, I'm going to deliver them to your hands. Jonathan knew that God could do that, and he decided to take a risk because he knows that God loves to gain glory for himself and loves to deliver his people. And Jonathan, if that had gone wrong, I don't think would have accused God of defaulting on his promises. But he still risked himself in God's promises, which is what we do in all of our lives, and certainly with our budgets. So that's what a church budget is, a plan to obediently invest our congregation's money in the promises of God. So I want to picture a hypothetical church budget with income at the top and expenses running down the side, and I just want to talk through each of those categories to think about how risk-taking obedience guides us in shepherding a congregation in each of those areas. And then when we finish, I'll have some extended time for some questions. So we'll start with income, the top line of your budget. For most of our congregations, the giving of the congregation is going to be the lion's share of budgeted income. And for that line of the budget, a key implication of what we've talked about so far is that faith matters more than size. Faith matters more than size. So I very frequently, in fact, 2 Sundays ago, get up in front of my congregation and say something like, look, I don't care about us meeting our budget nearly as much as I care about you being faithful with what the Lord has given to you. If you're faithful and we miss the budget, I'm elated. If we meet the budget, but you're not being faithful, that's failure, not success. Right? So often as pastors, I'll speak to the pastors here, we count material success by counting nickels and noses, right? How many people are in the pews and what do they do with their pocket change after the service? But again, we need to remember our God is a big God. He is in no way dependent on us to accomplish his purposes. He isn't waiting with his hands tied, helplessly hoping that maybe you'll lend him a hand by giving something into your church budget. That means that a healthy dose of the sovereignty and providence of God will provide a healthy dose of humility when we consider our church budgets. Again, speaking to the passages here, how much do we sometimes rail against the limitations of the budget? I certainly do that sometimes, at least in my mind. Right? If these people would just give an extra 20%, look at all the good we could do. Why would a sovereign God allow those limitations? Right? Think of how often in Scripture it is, in fact, our limitations that reveal the glory of God, like Jonathan's victory in 1 Samuel. So let me give you two implications of that idea that faith matters more than size. Implication number one is it affects how we talk about money. And we'll talk about this more this afternoon. One of the most precious commodities I trade in as a pastor is the congregation's trust that when I encourage them to give, it's because I love them, not because I need their money. Think about Paul in that very unusual thank you note that he writes to the Macedonians, Philippians chapter 4. He says, "Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that increases to your credit." Right? We give not because God needs a handout, but because he wants our hearts. And yet, how credible does it sound for me to say, I care more about your faithfulness than our meeting our budget, when the congregation knows that my back is up against the wall and I'm going to have to lay off staff if they don't cough up more money? Those are very dangerous times for the credibility of my professed love of faithfulness over size. Which is why for our church's budget, I try to build flex into the budget so that we're rarely in that situation. Now, if we are never in budget trouble, we're probably not taking appropriate risks. But if it happens too often, my congregation will begin to think, with good reason, that maybe I love the budget more than I love them. Again, we'll talk about that more this afternoon. And the second implication number 2 on your handout, it changes how much money we plan for. I want you to think about a conversation like this. I've actually heard in my own church before. The administrator says, well, it looks like we should expect about $800,000 in giving from the congregation this year. And the elders say, well, why should we set the budget on what we expect? We're people of faith, right? We believe in a big God. Let's stretch our faith. Let's aim for $1 million. Sounds very spiritual, doesn't it? But when we do that, I think we mislead people about the nature of faith, which is what you see there to the right of that implication number 2. Who are we putting our faith in when we do that? In that great chapter on faith in the book of Hebrews, Hebrews 11, the most frequently used word besides faith is the word promise. As Christians, our faith is grounded in God's promises. If you decide, despite what the treasurer says, of $800,000 expected to aim for $1 million budget, well, that may be fine, but don't call that faith in God, because he has made no such promise. And as the budget year closes and we're $250,000 behind, who's likely to reach down deep to give more because we're behind, the faithful or the faithless? An engineer budget crisis rarely motivates faithfulness. Let's not accuse God of defaulting on his promises when actually what we've done is we've tried to write checks that God hasn't ever signed. So, if faithfulness matters more than size, we need to be careful how we talk about money, thinking about Philippians 4, and we need to be careful how we construct the budget so that we are not misleading our people about what faith really is. Faith is faith in what God has promised, not what I wish he would have promised. But some of you are church plants, and you actually have another big line of income in your budget, which is fundraising. So let's talk about that. What are the implications of faithfulness as you think about fundraising? Well, fundraising is a beautiful example of partnership between churches. And it should normally be temporary. Like Paul in Philippians 4, when you go to raise money from other churches to help start your baby church, you need to believe that you are doing those people a great service, which is what Paul writes about so much in Philippians chapter 4, that he is doing what's good for them. He says he doesn't need the money. He says he can do all things through God who strengthens him. He says he's not looking for the gift. He's looking for the fruit that increases to their credit. Right? When I was 21 years old, I met Jeff, did you say Bezos, the Amazon guy. Met him on the street. He had just started Amazon.com, right? So I didn't think much of it at the time. It was like, oh, you're a book guy. Ha, no longer. But let's imagine for a moment that he had said, hey, Jamie, if you give me a $10,000 check right now, I'll give you 1% of the company. From today's perspective, who would thank whom? Would Jeff be so grateful I gave him money? No, I would be grateful for Jeff making me a billionaire, right? That's what we think about when we think about churches helping other churches. It is a wonderful opportunity to give them the opportunity to invest in a new gospel work that will, Lord willing, bring glory to God forever in heaven. So that's the upside. But there's a downside. And that downside is that sometimes that extra funding can actually begin to suppress the work of God in a church. So we need to be careful. I find it so interesting. In 2 Corinthians 11, Paul's writing to the Corinthians, and he says this, he says, did I commit a sin in humbling he's chastising them. He says, did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted because I preach God's gospel to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. We don't know for sure, but when you line up the dots, it seems quite possible what he's referring to is actually the gift from the Philippians that he commends them for in Philippians 4. So he goes to the Philippians, he says, you guys did a great job giving to fund my ministry. It was wonderful. I am so thankful because it increases the fruit to your credit. But then he looks to the Corinthians and he says, hey, guys, this is not good for you long term. It was good for a time, but it's not good long term. He doesn't want to infantilize the folks in Achaia and Corinth, even as much as he wants to praise and thank the people who gave the money in Philippi. Normally, a church should pay its own pastor. 1 Timothy 5:17, we'll look at that more this afternoon. Because it's good for a church to accept responsibility for the weight of its own ministry. And so when we think about applying these principles of faithfulness to the income we raise from other churches, there's a great upside. It's a beautiful example of partnership. And long-term, it can be risky. Risk-taking trust in God's promises will sometimes result in risk-taking trust in other church partners, but we should always obediently seek to stay in line with the focus of Scripture. Long-term dependence on outside sources can weaken a church because they don't feel the need to give. It's a model that's difficult to replicate. If you are forever dependent on outside sources, how can you plant a church yourself? And there's a loss of natural accountability of the pastor to the church and dependence of the church on the pastor. That's a natural cycle which is good for a church. So weigh the benefits and the costs as you decide how much you're going to let your church be dependent on others and for how long. There are certainly contexts when churches may for many, many years or even decades be dependent on outside sources. That should not be normal. Normally, we want a church to provide for itself. So that's a bunch of thoughts on the income side of the budget. Let's then just walk through some big categories in the expense side of the budget. I think an important one to begin with, I don't have much to say about it, is a place to meet. So this congregation gave money a long time ago to build this building, and so they can meet here. That's a wonderful thing. A church doesn't need to spend money on a place to meet. In the first century, it seems they always pick big places, like Solomon's colonnade in the temple or Philemon's house, where the church at Colossae met. But presumably those were free of charge. And yet, because your church, the one thing your church needs in order to exist is a place to meet, I think it's fine, particularly for a new church, if most of your budget is going to fund a place to meet. That, I think, is very much in line with the priorities the Scripture has. A place to meet that accommodates the whole congregation is a wonderful blessing, and it's worth spending money on it. The second item that we often see in a budget, I have more to say about, is staff. Risk-taking obedience comes from faith. Faith, Romans 10:17, comes by hearing the word of Christ. So it makes perfect sense that Christian churches would invest in solid Bible teaching. Again, going back to 1 Timothy 5:17, we see that particularly clear there, where Paul basically says, look, do you have an elder in your church who's ruling well? And then he explains, by ruling well, I mean his work is preaching and teaching. Well, then you should pay him so that he can focus his time on preparing good teaching for you. If you're going to have money in your budget for staff, there's two basic questions you need to figure out. The first is, how much do you pay? And that's where it's important to recognize that in the New Testament, every instance of a verse that talks about pay for church staff emphasizes generosity. Whether that's 1 Timothy 5:17 that says that we should give them double honor, or Galatians 6:6 is that we should share all good things with those who teach us, or Titus 3:14 that says that we should send workers on such that they lack nothing. Titus 3:13 where Paul says, do your best to speed Zenos the lawyer and Apollos on their way, see that they lack nothing. So we want to be generous. And I actually think that little verse in Titus 3 is a great summary of what our goals are for compensation. See that they lack nothing, right? Not Creflo Dollar, see that he has a second private jet. Certainly. But neither the way many churches do it, which is give him as little as you can afford to get away with, such that his ministry is compromised because he's having to get a second job, or his marriage is struggling because they don't have enough. No, see that he lacks nothing. See that his ministry is in no way hindered for lack of money, because he needs to feed his family. That's more important than him feeding you as his church. How do you put that into practice? I've often found that benchmarking off of comparable civil service positions in the government is useful. I don't think I say that merely because I'm from Washington, D.C. But certainly as I think about, being in a government town, the government has very similar goals for compensation as the church does. Nobody goes into government service, at least ideally, to get rich. You go into government service to serve, and yet the government wants, as much as possible, that high school principal or police chief or whatever be able to spend their entire career in public service without having at some point in time break away because they can't afford to feed their family. Very similar goals. You're not in it to get rich, so I make a lot less money than I did in business even 15 years ago. But I don't have to wonder if I can continue to serve my church because I can't put food on the table. Very similar to the government. So my church has found it useful to benchmark pastoral pay based on how the government pays their staff in Washington, D.C., and you might find that useful as well. And if you're a pastor and you think about your own compensation, just remember, it's not just about you. You are training your congregation how to care for a pastor and how your compensation is set. In one sense, your compensation is the umbrella for any future staff hires that you might make. Now, it brings a good question. What if your church can't afford you? Well, it's a tough one. Sometimes the fact that your church can't afford you is not real. They could afford you, they don't want to afford you. The money's there, they just don't want to spend it on you. Well, then you've got to figure out, is that because you're an unusually costly pastor? Like, your wife is from Australia, and once a year you got to go visit the grandparents, and wow, that's a big chunk of change. Well, it may be that you need to go to a church that can afford you. Other times, they legitimately can't afford you, in which case, for a time, it might be prudent to raise money from elsewhere, to get another job. But I think we want to see that as temporary, if at all possible, because of the priority that the Bible places on preparing excellent teaching for God's people. I was giving this same talk in China once to a group of pastors, and one of them made a very astute comment. He said, Jamie, here in Shanghai, we want the best of everything. The best education for our kids, the very best food, the best places to go on vacation. But when it comes to the preaching of God's word, anything will do. He said it's so commonly the attitude of churches here in Shanghai, when in actual fact we want to be jealous for the time that our pastor has to be able to prepare good sermons, and we should pay him a good salary so he can do that full time and not have to have a second job. So that's the first question. How much do we pay? I gave you a few guidelines there. The second question, well, how many people should we pay? Right? Some of you are small churches. You're just barely affording one pastor. You don't have to worry about this. But some of you are larger churches, and you're having to figure out, hey, beyond our main preaching pastor, do we want to set aside money to have other staff? A few thoughts for you there. There is advantage to having administrative help in a church. Deacons are wonderful, but as a church grows, sometimes deacons can't do everything. And it makes sense to have someone on the church staff to do stuff so that your preaching pastor is not distracted. I remember one particularly calamitous event with our health insurance as a church, and I talked to my senior pastor about it, and we talked about 5 minutes, and he said, now, I'm going back to my study to focus on preparing teaching. Thank you for letting me do that. It's in your hands now. And at that moment, I was administrative help, and I was serving him to make sure that he was not distracted from the teaching of the word, just like the deacons in Acts chapter 6. That's useful. I think it is also useful for a church to always feel a little understaffed, so that you are always thinking carefully, do I really need to hire someone to do this task? Or is there any way I can hand it off to people in the congregation? I think about Paul's writing in Ephesians chapter 4, where he says that God gave us teachers of the word, gives a bunch of categories, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until we all reach unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. That's what our job is. My job as a pastor is not to do ministry. It's to equip the saints for ministry, because they need to do that ministry among each other, among one another, so that they can grow up into maturity. If I do it for them, they don't grow up. So my job as a pastor is very much to kind of cut up ministry into bite-sized pieces and hand it out to the congregation. And as a pastor, I find it easier to do that if I always am sort of pushed in that direction. Like, I don't have enough staff to do everything. I need to push some of these things out to the congregation. That's a good pressure to feel. That's very different than what you'll hear from the church growth folks who say, overstaff so that you can grow. Maybe there are times when that's prudent, but generally I think that it's prudent to be a little understaffed, because the temptation for church staff is always to do it themselves, because it's easier to hand it to a paid staff person than a volunteer. And Ephesians 4 says, no, we got to push most of the ministry out to the volunteers. So as much as it's good to have other staff, that's one caution to have in mind. A second caution is that when you have overstaff and too many staff, you can professionalize ministry. So the people in the pews feel like, oh, I shouldn't disciple. That's the pastor's job. We've got all kinds of people on staff discipling people. That's not my job. And we can make ministry a little more niche than it should be, by which I mean, I can have a pastor for young adults and a pastor for young adults over 30 and another pastor for young adults who just got married. And I'm using my staff really to divide the church instead of to unite the church. Very often, the more staff we have, the more niche ministry can be, which feels great for the congregation because it's highly customized. And yet, I'm working against the general push of the New Testament, which is for us to be one, not divided up. Balance all that with dangers on the other side of understaffing. The danger of understaffing is pastoral burnout, a Messiah complex. As the pastor, I love rescuing people, and so I get to rescue people. And somewhere in there, hopefully, you can have some wisdom as to how many people you want to have on your church staff. Again, thinking about the importance, if at all possible, of a congregation getting to the place where they can pay for their own needs. That was a lot about staff. I'll have a little bit less about the other areas. Let's think about programs, ministries. As you consider things like children's ministry and youth ministry and neighborhood outreaches, and so you're going to have to decide how extensive, how polished, how staff-driven those ministries will be, which is very much a budget question. Do I fund the children's ministry at $500,000 a year? $50,000 a year? $5,000 a year? Well, there's a lot of decisions involved that are philosophy of ministry decisions when I think through how generously we're going to fund it. And as I make those decisions, I am seeding the DNA for my church and setting expectations for the kind of ministries they should expect. So a few considerations as I think about how much I should fund these different ministries in the church. Number one, like we talked about earlier, thinking about Ephesians 4, I should prioritize the involvement of the congregation. We often think about ministry programs as the way to get people in the door with a focus on the people as recipients of ministry. I think Paul would have us think as much, if not more, about the people doing the ministry, people as providers of ministry. That seems to be where his focus is. So don't just think about ministry as a way to get people in. Think about ministry as a way for us to pursue maturity together as we do ministry as a congregation. Second, I think it's important to prioritize excellence in everything we do. We are servants of the King. We want to prioritize excellence. And there is some degree of tension between my first consideration and my second. You can pursue excellence more when it's all done by paid staff. That's not helpful. We want to push ministry out in the congregation. But just because it's volunteers doesn't mean we leave excellence on the side. Again, we're servants of the King. He deserves for us to pursue excellence in everything we do. A third thought for you, prioritize programs that bring the church together rather than splitting them apart. I mentioned that before. Because the great focus of the New Testament is on the unity of the church. We're Jew and Gentile, rich and poor. We are men and women. We are slave and free in the New Testament. The focus is the fact that our identity is one in Christ. And so we should have a church where we have friendships and relationships that cross all these different divisions. Programs sometimes split the church up. They don't bring the church together. So if you're thinking about a youth ministry, well, is your youth ministry basically carving off the high school students to be their own church? Or is the youth ministry mainly about finding 20-somethings in your church to disciple the high school students and get to know their families? That's one version of that program that splits apart, another version that pulls together. Sometimes it's worth the cost to split apart. The 2-year-olds might just be their own thing, and that's fine. But where we can, let's try to use programs and budget dollars to bring people together. And fourth, we should prioritize programs that make the gospel attractive versus making the program attractive. What are you trying to win people with? Are you saying, come to this church because we have the most awesome children's ministry, and your kids will clamor to come here instead of to, what's the amusement park down the street? Knott's Berry Farm, right? Well, I can see how that brings people in the door, but what are you making attractive? Or do you want to have a children's ministry that glorifies Jesus, that makes the gospel attractive? That principle isn't going to answer all your questions, but I hope it's a good one to have in the back of your mind. Am I making the program attractive or the gospel attractive? Next category, if you look in your handout, administration. When you spend budget dollars on administration, essentially you are trading time for money. Right? So when I grew up in a very working class community, and every fourth Saturday, I would spend the Saturday cleaning the church building. Because I can't imagine my church growing up spending money on a cleaning crew. I now serve at a church in a center of an urban city with a bunch of young professionals, and we hire a cleaning crew. Why is that? Well, because the time-money trade-offs between my resource-poor congregation growing up, but time-rich, inclined us to do it ourselves. My current congregation, which is more affluent and is very busy, well, I would far rather my 20-somethings be off discipling and evangelizing than cleaning toilets. And that's going to be the basic trade-off you have for all the aspects of administration in your budget. Do I want volunteers to do this because money is more precious? Or do I want to pay people to do it because time is more precious? And my goodness, don't underestimate the value of deacons. I get away with so much ministry depending on my deacons in church that other church hire staff to do. And I think that's good. It's biblical. It means that sometimes we're a little more complicated than we need to be, but I think generally that is strengthening the church, building the church, and I love those deacons. We only have deacons for 3 years, then they step off, which I think is one reason why they're able to give so much energy and attention to that ministry. But I love what they do for us as a church. Don't forget your deacons, who were the original administrators in the church. Acts chapter 6, that's what they did. They administrated so that the unity of the church could be protected. One last category, outreach. How do you think about money you spend doing outreach, be it local or even global, what we would call missions? Well, a few thoughts here for you. I think a healthy mindset for that ministry is we want it to be healthy more than we want it to be big. Right? Your church is a church. It's not a movement. You're not trying to, start something that's eventually going to go all around the world. The Lord is going to do that. You're just a church. You want to focus on what is healthy, whether that's one missionary support or 100. How can we make sure that we are being healthy in what we do? And teach your congregation the importance of building an engine for ministry. Sometimes churches actually undervalue what happens right in front of them because, for great reasons, they love what happens overseas. And I just want to remember, there are many churches that can send that missionary to Uzbekistan. Only you can reach your neighborhood. I feel like I am the great defender of the church building to our elders, and they value that, which I appreciate, because none of you are going to fund my church building. We're the only people doing that. And so I want to, not in ways that are over the top, I want to make sure we protect money for funding the engine of ministry, be that staff or buildings, so that long-term we can do far more externally. How do you invest when you think about missions and outreach? It's very hard to figure out where to invest. We all know how to invest in things that we can measure that we can't see. That would be like the stock market, right? You're not going to visit Tesla's factory when you decide to buy Tesla stock. But you have all kinds of research and financials, and so you have a good sense that I know what that's worth. We also know how to invest in things that we see but we can't measure, right? So that crisis pregnancy center down the street. We know them really well. We know what they're doing. We're over there all the time. We can't really measure what they're doing. we don't really want to measure what they're doing. That can begin to push them in bad directions. Missions is investments you can't measure and you can't see. That makes it really hard, right? You don't really know what that missionary in northern India is doing. You certainly don't want him to send back reports to say, you're getting paid X number of dollars for every baptism. That's more like giving a report card to the Holy Spirit than it is managing your missionaries. You want him to be faithful. You don't know what the results are going to be, and you certainly don't know the time scale that those results will happen. I was struck the other day, someone was telling me that there are 250,000 people in Burma who trace their spiritual heritage to Adoniram Judson. Judson didn't see much fruit in his lifetime, but look what the Lord has done. If I paid Judson for baptisms, there would be a lot of deferred compensation there because the Holy Spirit decided to bring a lot of fruit 200 years later. So I can't see it and I can't measure it. What do I do then? Well, I try to get to know it as well as I can. And if I'm a small church, maybe I piggyback on another bigger sister church who can spend more resources getting to know their missionaries. So I try to spend 2 weeks every year overseas with our missionaries, getting to know their work, getting to know their families, getting to know the partners they're with. We have a house we built next to our church, so when they're in the States, they come and stay with us for that time instead of going somewhere else because we want to know them. There's no substitute for really knowing the work you invest in. If you have 100 people in your budget for your mission section and you're giving them each $100 a month, that maybe look great because you have, like the United Nations of flags on your budget, but you can't know any of them very well. I would say concentrate your dollars so that you can really know those people you're funding because you can't measure it and you can't see it. So that's a bunch of thoughts about the expense side of your budget. Let me address one last question, which is who is in charge of your budget? And I would say if the goal of your church budget is to accomplish as much ministry as possible, like any other charitable organization, then a committee of business-minded professionals would be the ideal management team. But that's not our goal. Our goal is to be faithful. Our goal is risk-taking obedience. And that means that a church budget is a spiritual document with spiritual aims, and that means it requires spiritual leaders. Or just think about how many spiritually fraught questions are wrapped up in your budget process, right? Should we continue funding this missionary, or is it time to cut funding and gradually get him to the point where he can come home? Right? Is this program over here fostering unity, or is it fostering consumerism? Should we cut the building fund to increase missions, or should we cut missions to increase the building fund? Well, we're trading spiritual values, and none of those are administrative questions. Those are all pastoral questions. Those are spiritual questions. Keep in mind the analogy I mentioned earlier of a church budget as a spiritual mutual fund. Who are those spiritual investment managers? Well, I would encourage you to find as your investment managers those people who have been given the responsibility for spiritual leadership in your church, not your finance committee or your deacons or your trustees, though they may be of assistance. Those are your pastors, those are your elders. Those Christ has gifted to your church whom you've determined meet the spiritual qualifications of 1 Timothy chapter 3. Those are the spiritual leaders the Lord has given you to guide you in every spiritual task as a church, and certainly this would be no less than those. Just think about how it works in Acts chapter 6. The deacons were to provide for the widows so that the apostles, who seem at the time to kind of be serving as church elders, are not distracted from their teaching. And yet, who was to make the spiritually fraught decision of which widows qualified for help? Well, in 1 Timothy 5, Paul told Timothy, the pastor, that he was the one responsible for figuring out who was on the list and who was off before he hands it over to the deacons who administer that work. Administration is full of spiritual significance. Elders and pastors should never think it's something we can merely delegate. We can certainly get lots of help, particularly if we are elders and pastors who don't have an administrative bone in our bodies. And yet, Titus 1:7 calls us overseers. That's a word with administrative connotations. Elders and pastors are overseers. We are in charge of administration. Generally, I think it is prudent for a congregation to approve a budget. I'm a Baptist, so I have more theological oomph to that assumption, but even if you're not, they're the ones giving to the budget, so I think it's prudent for them to approve the budget, but they should be led always by their spiritual leaders, by their pastors and elders. And again, I don't presume that those men are competent for that work. So where do you get help? Well, that's where you have deacons. That's where you have a finance committee. I spent 10 years in business before I became a pastor. It prepared me very little for managing a church budget. I was married for 15 years before I became a pastor. Managing a household budget was a much better preparation. If you're looking for competent help as pastors and elders for your budget process, don't assume that just because a guy is successful in business, he knows anything about budgeting. Maybe he's a great sales guy and has never seen a budget in his life. But find someone who seems to manage their household well in regard to the budget. You'll probably find someone who thinks well about a church budget. Just keep in mind, churches are very different than businesses. A business spends money in order to make money. A church is investing that money. A business is an enterprise that is oriented toward accomplishing something. A church is fundamentally about showing somebody. There are some overlaps, but I think they're more different than most people realize. So what should your elders and pastors do with regard to the budget? Well, I have 7 ideas for you. You don't have to write them down. They're actually in the discussion questions you're going to get to later on this afternoon. If you are an elder or a pastor, I think you need to ultimately be responsible for setting the top line income estimate, because that's a very pastoral decision. If we came up with $800,000 last year, should we set it at $800,000? Should we decide that this opportunity is worth so much that we're going to ask the congregation to give more this year? Did we ask them so much last year that we should lay off the gas a little bit this year? I think that final decision is a pastoral decision. How can we best lead the congregation in that balance of being aggressive for Jesus and gentle? Second, pastors and elders should lead in just making sure that the high-level allocations seem right. Should we spend half the budget on staff? Or do we feel like we're overstaffing or understaffing when we do that? Again, that's a pastoral decision. Should we spend 30% on missions and only 10% of the building? Should we flip those two? Third, I think pastors and elders are responsible for basic quality control to make sure that every line of the budget is going towards something which is worthwhile and God-honoring. Now, some of you have budgets that, frankly, are spending money on things you would prefer not to spend money on, but you want to be patient as the congregation matures for them to discover themselves. That's fine. So I'm not saying that elders need to make sure that the budget is ideal, but it should be ideal for where your congregation is right now. You're trying to look across all those budget lines and just say, do we have confidence we're spending money well? Pastors and elders are the ones who need to balance long-term plans with emerging opportunities. You know, we're trying to get our building renovated, so we're putting money aside every year for that. But now there's a guy we're really excited about planting a church next town over. Do we pause the building renovation plan to help him? That's what my church did one year. Again, that's a pastoral trade-off. Balancing long-term plans with emerging opportunities is something that your elders should be involved in. Fifth, pastors and elders should be assessing which opportunities for ministry are unique stewardship of your church versus others. There are some things your church is better qualified to do than almost anybody else. Outreach in your neighborhood would be an obvious answer. But there may be some particular skills that your members have, or a particular insight they have from your history as a church, or maybe you have special language abilities as a church, or insight into a particular culture, where you would say, okay, this is something we have a special responsibility for because we have a special stewardship and that will show up in the budget. Again, that's a pastoral decision. Elders and pastors should be the ones to break the budget. Right? When do you decide that things have changed and we need to do something different than we had budgeted? That would always come to my congregation to vote on, but the elders are the ones who lead in that process. We have last year, we had a wonderful opportunity to hire a guy who had been serving as an elder for many years, had finished his theological training, had been planning to go serve for another church. That didn't work out, and we had an opportunity. So the elders came to the church and said, hey, this isn't in the budget, and it's really expensive, but this doesn't come along every year. We would like to break the budget with your approval and hire this guy. That's something that elders and pastors can lead. A last thing, I would encourage elders and pastors to be the ones who talk most about the budget. I think it's fine for a deacon or a finance committee to show them the numbers, but I've found personally there are so many wonderful opportunities to teach. When I talk about the budget, I'd be jealous to let anybody else do that because I want to pastor my congregation. My congregation may not be familiar with the language of Chalcedon or the order of decrees in God's sovereign will, but they know the language of money. And so talking about the budget is an unusually good opportunity for me to pastor them in a language they're familiar with. And so I would encourage, if you're a pastor, think carefully before you let someone else talk about the budget, because this is a prime opportunity for you to pastor them. If you look in the next page, I just grabbed this from a book I wrote, but I have a little schedule. I talk about the budget at each of our bi-monthly members meetings, and every month I have a different little kind of mini talk that I give. I never prepare in advance. I normally just think about it while I'm walking up to talk to the congregation. But this is my opportunity to just highlight different aspects of the budget and what are the spiritual lessons I can give to the church about that. So, with all that detail thrown at you, let me conclude. A budget's all about faithfulness. Being a faithful steward of what Christ has entrusted to your church. And the most important stewardship you have is not for your money. It's not even for your people. It's for the message you've received. I find it interesting that in the New Testament, we are often told to be good stewards, but rarely does the context suggest that what the author is speaking about is our money. 1 Corinthians 4:1 tells us that we are stewards of the mysteries of God, and it's required of stewards that they be found faithful. 1 Peter 4:10 tells us that we are stewards of God's varied grace as we practice the gifts that he's given to us. So as you assemble your budget, and as you debate your budget, and as you deploy your budget and reflect on your budget, what stewardship do you have primarily in view? I hope that for you, faithfulness doesn't connote something boring, like old faithful, continually going year after year. I hope faithfulness brings to mind something exciting, the opportunity to steward the mysteries of the gospel through the risk-taking obedience of your congregation. I'm going to stop talking for a bit, and we'll just open up for general questions. I think we're down to one mic. Oh, we have two. So if you have a question, put up your hand. John will run speedily to you and tell us your name, remind us your church, and give us your question. Yes?
Vincent, Emmanuel Church, Orange County. I'm wondering your thoughts on, especially in Southern California, you talked about building budget. When should we think about faithfully saving for building? Buildings here like this could be $5 to $10 million, and we have a church that's 40, 50 members. What's it look like to faithfully save for a building, or even think about it, or having just a ton of money sitting in an account that we could be using for other things?
So when do you save for a building? I also come from a place where buildings are super expensive. So my church could put every dollar of our budget toward a building, and it would take us 5 years to save for the building that we're in. which would mean hiring no staff, no missionaries, just everything for the building, which obviously is impossible. And so I'm thankful for the people who paid that building off in 1927 so that we could enjoy it today. So I would say if you can get to the point where you can have a building, that's a wonderful thing. I'd encourage a church, as soon as you're in the place where you feel like you have the staff you need, to begin saving for a building. How much you do that, I don't know. Does that mean you're ever going to buy a building? It may not. It may mean that you get to know other churches in the area and you pray that some church which is dying would give you or sell you at a good rate their building, and that money goes to help renovate, revitalize that facility. I've seen many churches do that. But if you have no money in the bank, then you're rarely going to be in a position where you can even do that. So I would think because a meeting space is so critical to what it means to be a church, that would be a pretty early priority, is begin saving. But pray that the Lord would help you figure it out, because you're probably not going to buy a facility like this from scratch. You're going to need help. And ideally, that help will come from another like-minded congregation that says, we've got a facility, we don't have much of a congregation anymore, but we serve the same Lord as you do. How about you take it off our hands? Yes.
Eric, First Bilingual Baptist. You said that you build flex into the budget. What does that look like? Is it on paper, or is it just inflated numbers? How do you practically do
it's
that?
funny. When I gave our budget report 2 weeks ago to the congregation, I actually walked through what that flex was, and I told them why. I said, I want you to trust that when I tell you to give, it's because I want the fruit that increases to your credit, not because my back's up against the wall. And if my back is up against the wall, I will be honest with you, and I will tell you this time I'm not asking because the fruit increases to your credit, though I hope it does. Because I don't want to lay off my senior pastor. And so I explained there's a few things in our budget that we do to try to increase that credibility. One is our reserve fund. So a reserve fund or a line of credit can be useful because if for some reason we have a bad year, I don't have to balance the budget immediately. We can kind of hit that and then balance over the next 2 years. The second is we put money aside for facility improvements every year. We don't spend that money until the end of the budget year. So that's a piece of flex. If we don't give as I expected to, we just delay those improvements by a year. And third, we'll sometimes have pieces of the budget that are discretionary, say a kind of one-time block of funding for a project overseas we'd like to see, and we'll wait until we see some financial benchmarks hit through the year before we decide to release that money.
Joshua, Emmanuel Church of Orange County. Just in connection to building Flex, so, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about what we've done. Since we are a church plant.
You're 2 years old.
2 years old.
Okay. And your senior pastor chose not to come.
By the Lord's grace, we have godly men who are working with him to develop a budget.
Good.
And so one of the things that we had done, because we are small and we didn't know how many people the Lord's going to bring, or it was tough to even figure out monthly giving. And as we are growing as a church, one of the things that we put in place was a stretch budget alongside a budget. And so it was something where somewhere during the year, if the Lord was in growing our giving, or as we were fundraising, we were getting more funds, we had put in particular categories where we would like to allocate money for. So my question to you is, and we asked the church to vote on both budgets. And there were questions around that, and as to how it's going to work, and some confusion there. But it's been encouraging for us to exercise that. My question to you is, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I've seen churches do that. I think it can be really helpful. When you have a great amount of uncertainty as to how much money is going to come in. You're like, hey, it could be $200,000, it could be $400,000. We really don't know. It can be somewhat discouraging for a church when they could be giving $400,000, but you only spent the first 200 and you don't really know what's going to happen with the next 200, in which case those stretch budgets could be useful. It could be 2 budgets, or what I've seen more commonly is just to say, hey, here's what we're committed to, and here's our plan for the next $100,000 should it come, should the Lord choose to entrust us with that. I would just want to clarify for the congregation, again, like I said earlier, my goal is for you to be faithful givers. And so if we can't do the stretch budget, that doesn't mean things have gone wrong. And if we can, that doesn't mean things have gone right. We just want, because there's a high degree of uncertainty, as you can expect, we think it's prudent for us to have a plan that goes beyond kind of the expected value on the income line. So yeah, I think it can be useful. My church is exceedingly predictable. We're a government town. Everybody knows exactly how much they're going to make the following year. We're pretty recession-proof. So we've not done that, but it's only because what we have is pretty steady year to year.
Alex on Christian Fellowship Bible Church, West Covina. What percentage does your church give to the programs, and what are those programs at your church that bring the congregation together? And how do you go about when that program is not as effective or pulling money from that program?
How much we give to programs, it kind of depends on how you count staff time. But it would be, if you counted all the staff time that goes in, I think it would be about 10%. And that would be mainly student ministry, children's ministry, youth ministry. Those would kind of be the big 3. And each of them, we've tried to kind of our own ways to design the program so that it accomplishes its aims, but still tries to pull people together. I mentioned youth ministry. We're very much focused on trying to encourage people between the ages of youth and their parents to be involved in the ministry. So our youth retreat that's coming up next weekend, we have 45 students signed up and 20 volunteers signed up who are adults. I love that ratio. The youth ministry is not the youth pastor and the youth, it's a whole bunch of the congregation and the youth. Student ministry, we've very much tried again to make it so that our staff on campus are there to pull people from the church into the lives of students and pull students into the lives of the church. I call it kind of a bridge from the church to the campus to the church. It doesn't always work the way we want it to, but instead of, you're the evangelist to the college students, send us a letter when you get a convert, I want them to be the bridge to help us as a church be involved in the lives of those students. In children's ministry, it would probably be the least unity-focused. We're just trying to give the kids something good to do so their parents can be fed by the Word of God. And, of course, that's a lot of volunteers, and I think it's good for those volunteers. But that would be the place where it's pretty focused on high-quality programming, but mainly just giving the kids something so their parents can be fed. Yes?
Luis, First Bilingual Baptist Church. What factors do you consider when you're setting income or projecting income for the following year?
Yeah, when I first came into my position, I had a nice fancy regression model that I used where I tried to throw in all kinds of factors, and I realized that a church is not big enough generally to warrant. Basically, I had high precision, low accuracy. And so I backed up. And so for my income, I just look at what's our numerical growth going to be, and which for us isn't much because our building's pretty full. And what is the income per member I expect to see? And yeah, I'm sorry. Our income, so giving per member. And as I think about giving per member, I look at inflation rates. I look at what the federal government's going to do for a pay raise the next year. I look at kind of what the trend has been the last few years, and I just kind of make my best estimate. But that's for my church. I do find that a simple model is generally better than a complex model. It's proven more reliable. So I just look at those, number of members, giving per member, And I just try to kind of zero in on those two pieces of information. And if we're going to do a church plant, I'll even look, not by individual, but by the group. How much did this group of 40 people give to the church this last year, so I can be prepared, both for the sake of that church planter, hey, guess what? You've got $250,000 coming your way. And we should plan for $250,000 less in that situation. Yes?
How do you deal with a small church, say 40,
There's a mic behind you.
and you've got low income and seniors? That's what's making up your congregation.
What do you do if you have low income and seniors? My guess is your giving is probably fairly predictable. So I would probably budget pretty much for whatever the trend has been. If we're declining by 5% per year, then I'll budget, assume we decline by another 5% next year. If we're increasing by 5% per year, I would budget increasing 5% per year. My guess is your older saints their income is fairly predictable. They're pretty faithful. They have well-established habits. And so that trend line is probably going to be a pretty good sense, give you a pretty good sense of what's going to happen in the future. And I'll talk more about this afternoon, and I want to be content with that. If we're an older congregation and so we can't give very much, well, the Lord knows what he's doing. I can trust him with with that small budget. Praise God for whatever he entrusts to us, and we will do with it whatever we can. Yes.
Lucas Crossway Church in Pacoima. I came from a church previously where they had a budget mitigation committee. When can that be pragmatic, or can it be prudent? And that question really came up when you were talking about implication number 2. It changes how much money we plan for.
So they had a budget
Mitigation committee,
where
where when the giving falls beneath the budget, they'll adjust the budget on the fly, cap
gotcha.
spending, things like that.
I mean, my preference is to do that in advance. With some of those kind of big pieces we wait to spend later, because it's really hard to adjust the budget on the fly, because most of the commitments aren't really fungible. Like, we have the building we're going to have. I can't decide to have half the building. I don't want to fire staff who sometimes took years to put in place because of a short-term budget crisis. I want to feel the same about our missionaries as I feel about our staff. It might feel easier to reduce their support, but they're no less precious than the staff I have right in front of me. And if I look at those 3 pieces of my budget, that's 90% of my budget right there. And so if I have a budget crisis, there's not a lot that I can cut that's not cutting into muscle, which is why I would wonder if that committee would be better served to think through what in the budget do we want to save until we know the money's there, rather than cut things once they're actually in process. But I don't know your situation, and I could be misreading it, but yeah. Yes?
Desmond, senior pastor, Greater Height Mission Bible Church. No S on height is height, not heights, trust me.
Kind of like I'm from Capitol Hill Baptist Church, not Capitol Hills.
Yeah.
Yes, it's not a subdivision.
Got in trouble with that my first time at the church. Greater Heights.
Greater Height.
No S, pastor. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Been there for 2.5 years, and through God's grace, this church has been here for 61 years. But really not a budget, no planning of a budget, a foundation of a budget, and coming in, we're learning that we want to do this correctly. So where do we start? We're a church really about 50, 60 people. Where do we start from the years that this church has been surviving and God's grace doing these things and having people who are faithful, who are not CPAs, who are not bookkeepers, but who have been truly just following what has been going on for 60 years? How do we actually implement or build out a budget for next year?
Great question. Well, you don't have to have a budget to have a church. I know a church in China where the budget is a banker's box under the pastor's bed. It's probably not best practice, but there's still a church. Where do you begin? I would probably begin just by looking at the past. Now, I don't know how things are changing now that you're there, so maybe past data isn't particularly helpful. But my guess is it's better than nothing. I would just kind of look across the past 3 years and use that to get a sense of, okay, how much income do we have? And then with kind of loose hands on it, because it's your first year, big categories. So don't budget for staplers, but budget for staff, missions, facility. Give yourself some big categories, and maybe over the next few years as you get into it, you can begin to narrow those down and be more specific. We'll start with big categories, hold it loosely, but at least tell the congregation, hey, if you give, this is what we intend to do with the money. I think that sometimes people don't give to churches because they don't really know what's going to happen with the money. And so having a budget is it's a pastoral help to induce people to give, which helps them be more faithful to Jesus. And so I think it's a great, love that you're here, and I think it's a good direction to go. Yes.
Hi, Jane. Joe, Risen Church, Santa Monica. I have 2 questions. First one is about faithfulness on the giving side. So it's really hard to measure. Only God can measure faithfulness. But there's certain exercises we can do to do that. I want to kind of pick your brain on that a little bit. Is it something like looking at your member list and saying, we have 100 members and only 99 gave, so I need to talk to that one person? Or is it 2 sermons a year? Is it pulling folks aside saying, hey, Joe, I haven't seen you give anything in the past year, so are you okay financially? Those type of discussions. And the second question is, when you present the budget to the congregation, do you have folks that are saying, I don't agree on that budget line, Jamie, you got to take that budget line out? Or is it just more presenting it and everyone's just like, yeah, okay, we bless it? Or do you have the debates with the congregation as a whole? How does that work?
Great questions. Telling my congregation I care more about your faithfulness than our budget is a useful pastoral principle. It's very hard to actually implement because the Holy Spirit hasn't kind of given me the faithfulness factor for the congregation this year. There's a few things I look at. I do look at the portion of the members who don't give, and our elders actually work through that list precisely because what you said, I want to make sure they're okay. I generally assume if someone is not giving, there are problems elsewhere in their life that are easier to tackle. And so if, we'll have a list of people who don't give, and they're a student, they're unemployed, this person, that's concerning. I might give them a call. I'm rarely going to say, I'm calling you because you didn't give this year. I'm more just going to say, hey, could I come sit down in your living room and just see how you guys are doing? And I will probably find good things to focus on in that conversation because giving is sometimes the last piece to fall in place when someone's not living faithfully. It's rarely the first. I look at giving per member. I look at the difference in giving between a member in their first year and a member in their third year. That's a number I give to the elders every year. I look at the portion of our giving that comes from our top 5% of givers because I don't want us to be deceived in thinking that everybody's giving when actually we just have a few wealthy people who are giving more and more every year. So there's a few data points that I kind of publish for the elders once a year, a bunch of statistics, just to help us get a sense of how we're doing as a church in terms of our giving. How does our process work? In May of every year, after the elders have worked through our budget, I'll give a copy to the congregation. It's about 25 pages, so it's pretty detailed. That involves both numbers and our reason behind those numbers. We'll have a special meeting on a Sunday afternoon for anybody who has questions or concerns about the budget to voice them to the elders. And I encourage people, you don't have to wait till that meeting. If you have a concern or something you think should be done differently, why don't you send it to me ahead of time? Our Constitution, as long as our church has been around, has said that the budget is an up or down vote with no amendments from the floor, because that gets pretty chaotic. And so that was, 100 years ago they did it that way. We still do it that way. So we have that special meeting. The elders take all that feedback and think through how we want to change the budget proposal, but that the congregation just says yay or nay on the whole thing. because it's a package. It's not something you can edit easily from the floor. It's majority vote, yes. Yes.
You don't always know who the members are that give, because sometimes they just throw up a box.
That's true. We have the little Southern Baptist offering envelopes that we put in the pews. So we know, we have names behind probably 99.8% of the gifts that we receive. Your church may be differently, in which case you can't do some of what I talked about. And I tell people, as a pastor, I do not want to know how much you give. I think that really messes with your motivations for giving. But the computer wants to know how much you give so we can give you a tax receipt. So I encourage people to give it a way that's trackable, but that's not, because I know the computer knows.
We're going to go with Mako, and then we're going to go to lunch.
Excellent. Mako.
Mako from Evergreen Baptist Church. Our fiscal year starts January 1st. You mentioned that at Capitol Hill it starts August 1st. What is the reason behind it? And has Capitol Hill always started the fiscal year on August 1st?
No, in 2017, we shifted from a January 1st fiscal year. And the reason why we did that is because as our congregation got older and wealthier, we were getting more and more of our giving in December. So these days, we'll get 3 times as much giving in December as we do in November, which I don't think is unusual for a church. And if that's at the end of our budget year, then the greatest uncertainty around giving is at the very end, and there's nothing we can do. And so by shifting to a different fiscal year, we actually are able to lower our reserves, because if we discover that December giving didn't come in like we had hoped, we have 5 months or 7 months to adjust our spending, particularly with those kind of flex amounts, to make sure we can still land in the black.
Was it challenging to move the fiscal year from January 1st to like August 1st? Was it a big challenge for the congregation?
No, I wish my congregation cared more about things like that. We just did a 7-month budget one year, and then we went to a 12-month budget the next year. And the reason we did August 1st was more unique to us. I have a young congregation, so they tend to be gone in the summer. And so I could either choose August 1st or October 1st because I wanted the budget year to start just before or just after our members meeting. So we approve it and we start the new budget the next week, and we do our members meetings in July and September. And so I had to choose, do I present the budget when all the members are here, but we vote on it 2 months later when many of them are on vacation? Or do I present the budget when they're all on vacation, we vote on it when they're all here? I decided to opt for the first because I figure if you were here when we presented the budget, you don't like what's in there, you can still tell me about it. But if you weren't here when we've presented it, then the vote is not as useful. So that's why we ended up with August 1st.
Let's thank Jamie.